Climate change is among the world's most urgent challenges, and it affects every person, make that every species on Earth. Rising temperatures are fueling environmental crises, natural disasters, food and water insecurity, economic disruption, and increases in respiratory and infectious diseases. Sea levels are rising, coral reefs are dying, oceans are acidifying, and forests are burning. Kelsea Best is an assistant professor of civil, environmental, and geodetic engineering, as well as city and regional planning at The Ohio State University. Her research is focused on climate change, specifically how it intersects with human societies and infrastructure, how people may adapt to climate change effects, and how climate adaptation measures can be designed and implemented in a just and equitable way. Her unique multidisciplinary expertise affords a unique perspective on this most pressing problem. While Kelsea's research is grounded in data-driven methods like machine learning and agent-based modeling, it also seeks to expand the role of personal narrative and community participation in informing computational models. Some of her current projects include modeling individual and household migration decisions under climate change, assessing renters' vulnerability to natural disasters and implications for housing security, and understanding dynamics related to climate gentrification in coastal cities. Kelsea, I'm so happy to chat with you today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm delighted to be here.
So we often say on this podcast that Ohio State is one of the best places in the world for interdisciplinary research. And you are a perfect example with faculty appointments in civil, environmental, and geodetic engineering and city and regional planning. You don't even need a collaborator for your research to be interdisciplinary. Tell us how you arrived at this unique combination and what does that actually mean?
Sure, I'm happy to. So my path to get to OSU has been a little bit windy. My undergraduate background was actually in chemical and biological engineering. And as part of that degree, I discovered a minor in environmental studies, which really opened me up to interdisciplinary perspectives to complex environmental challenges like climate change. So I took an ethics of the environment class with a philosopher, and I took a history of environmentalism class in the history department. And all of that came together to really inform my interest in thinking about complex relationships between the environment and climate change and human well-being and society. And so I went on to do my PhD in earth and environmental science, which I was very fortunate that education was also very interdisciplinary. I was studying how climate change impacts human migration decisions in Bangladesh, so specifically how people decide to move or to stay in a place that's affected by climate change. And so as part of that, I was working with psychologists and political scientists and geologists and, of course, engineers as well. And my role in that project was very much the integrator, so bringing together the different data sets, the different ways of exploring this topic. So that's kind of where I was establishing myself as a scholar, is being the connector. And I think for me, with challenges that are as pressing and as interconnected and complicated as climate change is, I'm very much a believer in pulling together all the different ways of knowing that we can and finding those different pieces of truth that I think our disciplinary lenses can help us arrive to, but then putting those puzzle pieces together to try to find those connections between topics. So I ended up doing a postdoc in a civil and environmental engineering department. And then when I was applying for faculty jobs, I saw this position at OSU and was delighted that it was very clear, even just from the position, that there was an emphasis on interdisciplinary research around climate change and equity. And I thought that looks like the perfect job for me. So now, as this joint appointment in civil, environmental, and geodetic engineering, which allows me to focus on infrastructure and the built environment and how climate change and hazards interact with our built environment. And then city and regional planning on the other side, which allows me to think more about long-term adaptations, policy implications, really interactions with communities and cities. I think then bringing those together for me, all with a equity lens, is a really exciting space for me to start my career.
So what I love is that even as an engineering student, you went out and sought different kinds of communities. I mean, how many engineering students say, you know what, I really, really want to take history and ethics, which is amazing and fascinating. And I love the saying that you had said, which is, I'm connecting different pieces of truth, which I think is a well-grounded phrase to think about how we think about disciplines and how we look at a different problem, sometimes in the same way, but sometimes in different ways. And so, you know, kind of weaving through this, I know that you had a recent paper, and it was a study published, I believe, in Nature Communications, which really, really intrigued me. So you examined who is most at risk of isolation due to sea level rise, which can inform community adaptation plans and help ensure that existing social vulnerabilities are not exacerbated. So in other words, many of us in the community see dramatic images of flooding in coastal areas, and you know, some of us are like, I'm glad I live in the Midwest. And so this is a concern. We see it during or immediately after hurricanes, and we see surges. But there are equally significant long-term effects, even after the rain goes away, where the community has to think about how do we recover. So talk a little bit about this study.
Sure. So this study really gets at concepts that are foundational to my work, which are thinking about how climate change affects different communities and different kinds of people in different ways. So this concept of vulnerability gets to the idea that some communities and some people have less access to resources to be able to respond and recover to those effects of climate change. And generally, these are groups that are historically marginalized, so have been excluded and left out of our political processes. So in this country, it's very often lower income people, people of color, who have less money and financial capital to recover when they're impacted by climate events, but also, as I mentioned, less of that political capital, potentially less access to social networks. And so that means that that recovery can be very challenging, and when not addressed deliberately, it can exacerbate that historic inequity and kind of increase that vulnerability for people. So for this study in particular, I was interested in thinking about how sea level rise in coastal communities might not just impact those households and those places that are directly flooded, which is generally how a lot of our burden metrics and adaptation plans think about sea level rise is, okay, how many people will be flooded? But thinking about how people might be burdened without being directly flooded. So specifically, this idea of isolation is the concept that even if my home is not directly flooded, if I can't get to places that are important for me because my roadway is flooded, so if I can't get to the grocery store, if I can't take my kids to the nearest public school, if I can't get to a hospital when I need to because the roads around me are flooded, then those individuals and those communities are also burdened by sea level rise. So with some collaborators at the University of Maryland and the University of Canterbury in New Zealand, we created this metric where we overlaid road network maps with projections of sea level rise to see exactly where we would expect people's access to these essential services to be disrupted. And so we called that our isolation metric. And the next step then that I was really excited about was to think about who are those people who might be isolated. So that's where we pulled in more sociodemographic information, these concepts of vulnerability. And we actually did show that it was communities of color that were expected to be disproportionately at risk of isolation as sea level rise is increasing. And so that, to us, pointed to, again, these kind of embedded inequities in the effects of climate change, and then really using that to motivate deliberate, targeted adaptation that seeks to correct those inequities.
So you talk about these inequities across the communities, but you also mentioned, and just the story that you said with the roads, that we are all connected, and we all use the word burden when we think about climate change. And I think one of the things coming through the pandemic, we all understand how we are connected as one society, one community, even if there's inequities in certain elements and aspects. So it's really wonderful that you're calling that out and showing how, one, we are all impacted, but the level of impact and recovery might change based on, you mentioned social economics, marginalized communities. So one, keep working on this, and really highlighting this because of the element of we need to hear it more. This podcast is called Enginuity. So we obviously spend a huge amount of time talking about innovation in the College of Engineering and novel approaches to solving problems. So how does creativity and innovation inform your own research? And someone told me, a little birdie, that said you were in an improv comedy troupe in college. So I know there's at least some creativity in those veins.
Yes. So I think creativity is a huge part of my work, and I think it really informs my approach to trying to find maybe new ways of looking at the problem or new connections between the environment and society. So the example of the isolation study really came about because my collaborators and I saw that decisions were being made based on one metric and kind of thought, wait a minute, is that the right metric, or is it the only metric? How can we expand what that concept of being burdened by sea level rise might mean, and then how do we measure it? So I think I'm continuously trying to find those connections that are not immediately obvious, but are important, because we do know that, to your point, it's all connected, and these effects of climate change will have the obvious impacts. You know, after a hurricane, you can see the damage, but also these potentially more hidden effects that still have a big effect on people's well-being. So as an example, I have a study that's looking at the effects of hurricanes, not on damage, but on rent affordability longer term. The idea being that a disaster could have cascading effects into housing markets, and those effects could burden certain groups more than others, so renters in particular. And that study came about because I was trying to buy a house and also just thinking about how difficult the housing market is. And, we have a rent affordability crisis in this country, and then thinking about, oh, I bet climate change affects that too, because it's affecting everything. And then for me, my next step is to go try to find data that can support that, or think about a way to model it. So in that sense, I think I try to keep my brain in creativity mode so that I'm open to seeing those connections and then kind of chasing them down.
I would probably guess that most would not realize that engineers can be creative. And they do know that data informs the decisions, but the input is that creativity. So if you think about, the impact of this research, and of course, talking to, say, civil engineers and civil and regional planners, thinking about how they would use this information. Can you give us some insights on that? Like, what is it that you would like others to do with this information?
Sure. So a big piece of what I want my work to do, and specifically what I want to do in this role at OSU, is to bring forward this idea that engineers can be creative, and also that engineers can really think about people first. We can center questions of equity and access and well-being in our engineering decision making to arrive to a better solution. And I think maybe sometimes traditionally engineers have been trained to just think about the technology or the problem, and the human piece is separate. But I really want to, for my students included, bring that element of, no, engineers have a responsibility to be thinking about who has access to our solutions, how do our solutions move the needle towards a more just society, or if we're not intentional, how do our solutions have the potential to cause harm, or, as I keep saying, exacerbate these existing inequities. So I hope that my role shows students and others that you can be an engineer that centers people and equity, and I'm having a lot of fun exploring that in my first year here. So I'm teaching a fundamentals of environmental engineering course. In the first lecture, I sprinkled in environmental justice because it matters that our environmental engineers going out into the field think about who lives near this water treatment facility, or what are the downstream effects of this waste discharge. So really trying to get that in the minds of students and colleagues.
And I'm sure the world would love us even more, engineers, if we did think about people first in communities and wellness and access. I totally agree. What's next?
So right now I'm in the process of building my lab, so looking for graduate students and undergraduate students. But I have a couple of lines of research that I'm really excited about. So one, I mentioned that my PhD work was looking at climate change and human migration. And a lot of that work was focused on what pushes people to leave a certain place. And I'm becoming much more interested now in looking at the other side of that coin, which is, where do people go and what do they need when they get there? So thinking about receiving communities and combining, again, that civil and environmental engineering focus on infrastructure with planning to think about how do we intentionally design and plan for equitable receiving communities that are able to provide infrastructure, jobs, opportunities, and social cohesion to people who might move into these places. And so that's one area that I'm very interested in. I'm planning on developing a course to be cross-listed with city and regional planning and civil and environmental and geodetic engineering that will focus on engineering and planning for forced displacement scenarios to start to get at some of those questions and also encourage some ethical engineering conversations.
This is wonderful. I have another word, ethical engineering. So this is wonderful. This is great. And, Columbus, I think, is growing to be one of those receiving communities.
Yes.
And so it's fantastic that you're here. You're here at The Ohio State University, and you're really engaging our students in different ways of thinking. So, Kelsea, you certainly seem like the perfect engineer, planner, hybrid to help us all understand how the climate change crisis is affecting and will affect our most vulnerable communities. Your Enginuity is really based on your unique perspective and how you really reflect and bring together the different disciplines to solve these really, really, really difficult problems. And I'm thankful for it.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a lot of fun to be able to share this with you.
Thanks for listening to Enginuity. Stay up to date on all the amazing innovation and groundbreaking research happening within The Ohio State University College of Engineering by connecting with us on X, Facebook, Instagram, and Threads at OSU Engineering.